Tiles are an affordable and durable covering, but they have a small drawback. Installing them is quite complicated. Yes, quite is relative, but installing this flooring is more complex than other types. Hiring someone to install it would significantly increase the price. So today, I'm here to talk to you about the little tricks for laying tiles that I wish I had known back in the day. Let's get started. Let's go over the steps for laying tiles, and we'll break down each step in detail. What are the things that are most recommended? I'm going to speak to you 100% from my own experience. Someone else may have had different experiences and can share them in the comments, and it will be great to read all kinds of experiences with tiles. But anyway, as I said, in my case, this would be a bit of the process and the things that have happened to me. Step number 1, check if the surface is level. For me, this step is super important. When I say level, I don't just mean whether it's straight or not, but we also include where the tiles are going to fall, meaning lining them up on the floor or on the wall in both places. Mainly, it's about knowing if we're going to start with a half tile or a whole one and where the last one will end up. See if we're going to end up with a little piece like this on the last one if we start with a whole tile at the beginning. All these little details need to be taken into account. So it's super important to take exact measurements, make sure everything is perfectly aligned, and always know where you're going to start, where you're going to finish, and where it will end up. So, see the space we have left for the last tile. As for leveling, we would take a long strip, or preferably a level, and check. So if it's completely level, or if there are some little gaps, or if there are bumps that stick out more in some places than others. This is super important because even though we might think we can finish leveling it later with mortar, this can get more complicated than expected. And we might not end up with a completely perfect result, or at least not from our point of view. I have to say that even if you're a perfectionist and you like things to turn out super perfect in the end, if you don't do this professionally, it's very hard to achieve a professional result because if you're not a professional, of course, you run into some difficulties. Professionals likely have experience with such issues and can solve them more readily. So, the result will usually be good, but there will be some little flaw, that's for sure. The second thing would be applying the mortar. In this case, I always use a flexible mortar because it allows you to lay tiles over existing tiles. Could we remove the old tiles? Yes, but I think it could be quite a tough job and I'm not sure how necessary it would be, because by removing it, the floor would probably no longer be level. It's different with the walls, not on the walls. If we put it directly over the existing covering, it will probably take up more space. If we don't mind, because the room is quite big, then it will be much faster, as long as the ones underneath are well placed and well glued. If they're not, then you have to remove and replace them. In the case of the floor, that wouldn't happen, right? Because even though it takes away a little bit of height, it's not going to be too much. We won't notice it much. I always use flexible mortar because it sticks really well to any surface. And like I said, it wouldn't be necessary to chip away the floor tiles. Just by applying the flexible mortar and placing the tile on top, it would stick really well. On the other hand, if we use another type of mortar, it could end up coming loose over time or not stick well enough. When we lay the tile, we need to leave an expansion joint. Every time I've asked about this, I've been told different things, so I'm going to speak from my own experience. There are people who don't leave any joint at all, and there are people who leave a lot of joint. Well, I usually leave between 1 and 1.5, unless it's inside the house. I've always done it that way and I've never had any problems. And well, it's always better to leave 1 than 1.5, since they end up a little closer together. And depending on the design of the tile, it will look better. Okay, so now we have our mortar ready, we have our leveling pieces, and later on I'll talk to you about them, about which ones we can use between 1 and 1.5 in my case. Now we'll discuss double gluing. Previously, people used the well-known blobs. What did it consist of exactly? Well, it was about putting blobs on the floor and placing the tile on top. And by using these blobs, we managed to level the tile by raising or lowering it, depending on how we needed to position it. It wasn't that long ago that this thing with the blobs was done, in fact, when we started with the renovations. My father even used these blobs for a bathroom, because my father, together with my mother, learned from a bricklayer who built their house, and this bricklayer used blobs. He knew how to do it that way, and that's how he did it for me here at home. Over time, we've seen that it's not done well. That's not how it should be done, so we've been learning and perfecting the technique. In this case, the blobs are easy because you can control very well whether it's level. The tile and leave it level, let's say, but it has quite a few drawbacks. The first is that over time they can come loose, and in fact they do come loose. I've seen this frequently, and the second point is almost the most crucial to me. It's that since there are areas the mortar doesn't touch, if anything falls on top, the tile will probably break since it's completely hollow underneath. And this, well, honestly, it's a real pain, isn't it? Since everything is newly installed, if it breaks, you'll have to remove and replace the tile. I guess for these reasons, people have stopped using blobs and started using double gluing. Double gluing basically consists of spreading flexible mortar all over the floor with a notched trowel. So you make the lines and then apply the double gluing to the back of the tile. And then you just place it on the floor or on the wall. The double gluing allows for better adhesion between the floor and the tile, or between the wall and the tile. So it sticks better and it also helps the air escape. That's why it's very important that when we make the lines with the notched trowel, we do them completely straight and not like this. Because if we make these shapes, the air probably won't escape, but if we do it completely straight, it will. If we then stick our tile along these sides, the air will have escaped and the tile will be completely attached. I usually put a super thin layer of mortar on it. Really, with flexible mortar, you don't need to put such a thick layer of mortar. Just put a layer that's thick enough for it to stick. But putting on a thin layer allows us to keep the same level as the floor already has. So, if the floor is already level, you just have to follow it with a thin layer. Placing it is much faster and we save a lot of material. On the walls, we do exactly the same. Maybe we make it a little bit thicker. If it's not completely level, it's much easier to find an uneven wall than an uneven floor. But could that happen like this? In the case of the walls, yes, we add a little more thickness so we can work with this small unevenness in the wall. How do we level the tiles? Yes. We've ruled out using blobs. We've already said that blobs, of course, when you chip away, it's easier to level and all that. If we make a very thin line on the floor and the floor or wall is uneven, then it's much more complicated for us. That's what the fascinating levelers are for, and ever since we discovered these levelers, we use them for everything. I mean, for any tile we install. Levelers, how do they work? Well, basically, you place a tile, you put the leveler, and then you place the next tile. And usually there are some pieces that are accessories that go on top, and with some pliers you tighten them and everything stays completely level. There are several types of levelers, and we'll talk about them in a moment. But what are these levelers for? One, as the word itself indicates, is to level, and two, and this was explained to me by a follower, and I think it makes perfect sense. And that's because when the mortar sets, usually the tile tends to sink a little bit. So if the leveler is already in place, this tile, even though it tends to sink, the leveler won't allow the tile to go down. And therefore, it will always keep the same height as the others. That is, if we leave the floor perfect and say it's perfect, everything is leveled and that's it, I can go to sleep just the same. We wake up the next day and see that even though we left it perfect, one has gone down and you say, how could that have happened? If it was great yesterday, well, it turns out that the mortar, when it sets, the water dries out. And then it's possible that some of the tiles might sink, and so the level we set the day before doesn't stay the same. These levelers will help us not only to level, but also to prevent these tiles from sinking, not just on the floors, but also on the walls. Although this usually happens on the floor, since, well, because of gravity, it's more common for it to sink on the floor. There are many types of levelers. I have used two, and I'm going to explain when I would use one and when I would use the other, since I found advantages and disadvantages to both. I'm going to talk to you first about the one I used before, the first one we used. This leveler works really well, it's very strong, and when you tighten it with the clamp, everything stays perfectly level. If one of them ends up slightly sunken, you can use the leveler to lift it up. You tighten, and that lifts the tile until it's completely level. Levelers are generally quite affordable, so I think it's worth buying them because everything turns out much better, especially if you don't usually install tiles. And I love this leveler, but it has one disadvantage. And that's when you remove it, usually because it's so strong a tiny part stays stuck. And of course that's pretty hard to remove. And if you start trying to take it off with a cutter, you might end up breaking the tile a little or chipping it. So you have to be really careful, and when you take it out, you need to be as precise as possible so that it tries to break from the bottom and not just crack, because the problem comes when it breaks, you end up with a little piece sticking out, and of course that ends up being visible, and sometimes it's pretty hard to remove. So this leveler, as a big advantage, is perfect for leveling, but as a disadvantage, it breaks more easily and then it leaves little lumps. The second leveler, which is the next one we use, this leveler has less strength to lift. That is, if you start tightening it a lot, like with the other one, it will probably end up breaking. And then you have to put another one in. If you have access to be able to do it, this is the disadvantage, that it doesn't have the strength to lift the tile. The big advantage is that since it breaks more easily, it almost never leaves any residue, unlike the other one. With the other one, you can see that tiny piece that has broken off, and in this case, it's completely clean. So when would I use one and when would I use the other? The one that's stronger, which is the one we talked about first, I would use that one. When the wall is very uneven, if we take measurements, place the level, and see that the wall is very warped, that it has a lot of bulges and so on, well, I would use this leveler because it will help us make the wall completely level. In the case that the wall or the floor is pretty good, pretty well leveled, just using the other one would be enough, since what it will do is prevent it from sinking when it sets. And even though we won't be able to use it to level, if the floor is already leveled, we just put it in place and leave it there. So that the next day we don't find one tile lower than the other. That will depend a little on how our floors and walls are when it comes time to tile. First, we'll analyze it as discussed. After the analysis, we'll decide which type to buy. We already have the steps to see how the surface is. Place the tiles with flexible mortar and with double gluing. And we've also talked about the levelers. Now we need to know what happens if we come across a corner or if we have to start with half a tile. How do we cut them? We have several options. We have always used the grinder to cut, and the truth is that the grinder works well for making cuts. They're a bit rougher, but it doesn't leave a completely clean cut. Even if you buy a new disc and use it just a few times, it usually chips a little bit. So we have the option of the manual cutter. I think this is a great invention, and the good thing is that you can place your tile on it. You go over it several times, pressing hard enough so it can break, then you give it a sharp hit and it splits in two. We can make the cuts either in half, just a small piece, or even at a slight angle. So we can really adapt the cut perfectly. Honestly, I'm thrilled. I've used it frequently since trying it. The good thing is that it lasts a really long time. In fact, we use one that's over 50 years old. It belonged to my grandfather. My grandfather was a bricklayer. He worked as a bricklayer his whole life, and he used this to cut tiles. It was passed down gradually through generations, and now I possess it. And simply by changing the diamond, we can get a super clean cut, and it's practically like the machine is new. This one I have is for smaller tiles, and it's the one I use to install the tiles in the kitchen. Ferraki sent me another one for larger tiles, which I used for the floor. This manual cutter can fit up to 85 centimeters of tile, so we can use a huge tile, and that way we can make sure that we won't fall short. The other cutter I'm telling you about, I'm not exactly sure what the perfect size would be to cut them, but it's quite a bit smaller. So, depending on the tiles we're going to install, should we choose one cutter or the other? I would almost recommend that you go ahead and buy it now. A fairly large one, because with the large cutters we can cut small tiles, but with the small machines we won't be able to cut large tiles. So since we don't know about the future either, well, we might need larger tiles. If we buy a fairly big one now, it will last us for many years. If we want to make more precise cuts, for example for pipes or drains, the ideal thing is to use hole saws. What's going on? We don't usually use hole saws, even though we should. We don't do it because it's completely hidden and you can't see it, but it looks much more professional to use the hole saw. The problem with the hole saw is that they're very expensive, so a set of hole saws can cost you 200 euros. If you're not going to get much use out of it because you don't usually install tiles, or you're almost done with your house, or it's just one wall and that's it. I'm unsure if buying hole saws is worthwhile. It would have been worth it for us if we had bought them at the start. I don't rule out buying them eventually, as you do need them in the end. But if you plan to do your whole house and you're at the beginning of the process, then I do recommend that you buy the hole saws. If it's just a few small projects, then, well, we can do it with the grinder and it turns out pretty well. It's not absolutely perfect, but like I said, it's completely covered and hidden afterwards, so no one is ever going to see it. It's just in case you're a perfectionist and you like things to look good and everything to look perfect. Before placing the furniture, ideally you should buy the moldings, which, as I said, can cost around 200 euros. You have to keep in mind that there are different diameters of moldings and they can also be used as accessories with different types of tools. There are moldings that work with drills. We remove the accessory that comes with the drill by default, attach the molding and make the hole. There are also molding accessories for grinders. So we would remove the disc and put on the molding accessory and then we could cut it. I've only tried the one for the drill and I love it. Honestly, I do have hole saws for wood because they're pretty common to use and besides, they're very cheap. I mean, there's a big difference between the hole saw that's only for wood and the ones that are only for tiles. Because the hole saws for wood are much more affordable. So well, if you have to make, for example, a countertop and you need to install a built-in faucet that comes directly out of the countertop, then we'll need a wood hole saw. And in this case, it's always good to have a set. Well, now we've covered the cutting part, so let's move on to cleaning during installation. For me, one of the most important steps is that when we're laying the tiles, it's very important to clean the floor really well, especially regarding the levels in this area. Normally, when you tighten it, the mortar usually comes out from underneath and tends to get stuck there. What happens then? Well, when you remove the little piece, you see a big lump of mortar there that is really hard for us to remove later. In fact, we have a terrace, not a small balcony, where we don't clean anything. We kept putting them on, boom, 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 because we were in a big hurry, and when we took everything off, oh my gosh, what a mess. In fact, we bought a product called cement remover, and we used it to remove the cement that had built up. Wasn't it a nightmare from then on working on that balcony? Always, we go with a cloth or a sponge, cleaning absolutely everything. And if you can tuck it in there and leave it nice and clean, even better for that. One thing that works really well is that when you put the mortar on, you remove the excess from the sides. So when you press it down, it won't stick out as much. This can be tricky sometimes because, for example, I tend to forget to do it. But if you remember, that's ideal. Because really, the mortar comes out to the sides and it's pretty hard to remove, so in my opinion, cleaning as you go is essential. Using a sponge can be better than a cloth. We've always used a cloth, but one day, by chance, I didn't have one. And I used a sponge, and since then I almost always use a sponge. You have to wring it out really well, because if the sponge is wet, well, it absorbs water very well. Of course, so if it's damp and we press, that water will probably come out and it could make the tiles sink a little or become uneven. So we're going to wring out the sponge really well and run it over the whole surface, and we're going to leave everything super clean. I assure you this will save you a lot of work later on. What happens if even after cleaning and trying to leave it as clean as possible, we apply it and we end up with a lump, which can definitely happen. We previously used a utility knife, which would sometimes cause chipping. Some tiles, this really pisses you off because, of course, you just installed it and now you already have a chipped tile, you have to break it, take it out. After a lot of hassle, we switched from using a utility knife to a scouring pad. And while it's true that it doesn't have as much strength as a utility knife, many times it's more than enough to remove these little blobs that are left behind. Because if we've done a good cleaning, there shouldn't be a big blob, just a little one. So we take our scrubber, wet it with water, and then start scrubbing all the corners and all the edges so that everything is completely clean. Before applying the grout, what are we going to do before applying the grout? Well, since we've scrubbed it with the sponge and everything is pretty wet, what we're going to do is dry the wall completely, all the way. Because if we prepare our mixture, we leave it with the perfect thickness to apply it and make it look perfect and everything. And it turns out that the wall is a little damp and water has gotten in through the crack, through the joint. When we apply the grout, that water is going to absorb it and make the grout much more liquid. And most of the grout will either disappear or be absorbed inside. And this is really frustrating because then you have to let it dry, apply another coat of grout, and in the end, it slows down the process a lot more. So we use the scrubber damp but not too wet, meaning we wring it out really well. And then we wipe it down with a cloth, preferably microfiber so it absorbs all the water. And we leave the wall completely clean. And then we apply it. Prepared, we usually make it somewhere in between, not too liquid and not too solid. Something thick enough so you can apply it well, but liquid enough so it can spread properly. There are several ways to apply the grout, and we've tried, for example, using some bottles and putting it directly on the little hole, then with spatulas and so on. And honestly, the way that has always worked best for us is with a rubber trowel. These rubber trowels leave the grout exactly where it's supposed to be, and they remove everything else, so can we use what we remove to apply it to the rest of the wall? And honestly, after trying many things for grout, I definitely prefer the rubber trowel. Well, this is basically the process and the things we've learned as we've been installing tiles. I'm sure we still have a lot more to learn. And like I said, if you have any other experiences, tips, tricks, or anything else, you can leave them in the comments. They're always very welcome and really helpful, both for us and for everyone else. I hope you enjoyed this video. See you in upcoming videos soon. Thank you.